Welcome everyone to this FWR event, Water Trading Across Regions, Challenges, Opportunities and its Role in Supporting Resilience. This event has been organised by the Foundation for Water Research, an independent community of professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. The FWR community provides guidance and strategic thought leadership for the IES, or Institution of Environmental Sciences, water activities, and I will share a link in the chat shortly to our free mailing list so that you can stay in touch and up to date with our work. I'm really pleased today to introduce our chair, Patrick Bulmer. Patrick worked in the water industry for over 30 years, most recently as Head of Water Resources and Environment at Bristol Water. He was a founder member of the regional West Country Water Resources Group and has been involved in planning of new resources such as Cheddar 2 and the Mendip Quarry Scheme. He also sits on our FWR Water Resources and Quality Technical Panel. Thank you so much, Patrick. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ethne. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. This is going to be a session which focuses on water trading between regions. As we are aware, after one of the hottest, driest periods that our nation has seen, this is something which has a great deal of focus for many of us. And so I'm pleased to be able to introduce a quite exceptional range of experts in this particular area to be able to give you real insight into what's going on. They will be giving what we refer to as sort of flash presentations, they're high-speed presentations, so with the intention that you get an impression of what's happening. But I think one of the main focal points that I'll want to try to keep us to today is the Q&A session at the end, because this is an opportunity to ask people who are very much at the heart of this process what they think, how they think it's going to work, and what the problems are that need to be addressed. So I am going to sort of keep my presentation, my introduction, therefore, really quite short, and I'm going to drop straight over to Merrick. So Merrick Goff has worked in the industry for almost exactly the same length of time that I has, and he's been in a number of different roles. But many of you will be familiar with him working in WRSE, Water Resources in the Southeast, and is now the managing director of WRSE. So what I would like to do would be to leave you now with Merrick's capable hands.
Thank you, Patrick. And yes, think I have worked in the industry as long as you. And good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to try and get through this in 10 minutes. And I promise I'm going to stick to time. Give us that good question answer session at the end. So if we can just move to the next slide. So for those of you not familiar, then we'll end up with having what is a region. So the regional plans, we've got 5 regions set out across the country at this moment, and that really came from the national framework. Each of the regions looks at the water resources across the companies and also, where it can, the other sectors as well. But we'll come back to this point afterwards. It looks at that kind of wide range of solutions and tries to find an optimum solution. Typically, all the plans are adaptive, and we'll talk about why that's important a bit later. And one of the beauties of what we just went through, as much as I can say that at this moment in time, having gone through the process, come out the other side, but during the process, it was kind of a bit short sometimes, but we were able for the first time to look across the regions and consider where movement of water from one region to another was really beneficial. And that's also not only just from the kind of physical movement and those new schemes, but also where a virtual trade, where one region was able to take a reduced supply for a short period of time, actually could help out another region. So trading in 2 senses. One of the bits we had to do around this is looking at how this was going to become informed part of your WMP, your Water Resource Management Plan, and it is a best value plan and not just a plan which is based on least cost. One of the other key critical things about all these regional plans is how they achieve the government policies and aligns with the government policies for their future direction. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So delivering national policy, it started off with the NIC, preparing for a dry future. We then had the first round of national framework, and there's been another one published this summer for National Framework 2025. The first one formally established the regional groups. and also set out the projected future needs for the environment. And the 2025 National Resource Picture has updated that view. National infrastructure strategies, we ended up with a policy around the drought resilience, moving to a 1 in 500 kind of drought resilience event. The environmental improvement plan set out those leakage reductions and household consumption, non-household consumption reductions. So there's interim targets, the final ones, and then the integrated plan for delivering clean and plentiful water, accelerating the investment of supply infrastructures, and really help set out some of the enabling actions for us to proceed with these transfers. If we can move to the next slide, please. So that comes around a typical challenge for each of the regions, and none of the regions were different in sense of those challenges, and they're quite significant. In the southeast, effectively, we derive a water resource management plan across the 6 companies, and all the regions pull their plans together and derive regional plans as well. But the range of challenges we face is quite significant. And the benefits from trading help meet some of these challenges over a short period of time. So in the southeast, we know the challenge can be as great as 2.7 billion litres of water per day by 2075, or as little as just under 1 billion litres. But there is a need for more water. The biggest drivers, environmental protection, without a shadow of a doubt. And the need to kind of almost reconfigure the supply systems that we have used and grown up with and have been here since the 1800s, totally reconfiguring them now as our understanding the environmental needs becomes more prevalent, and we understand what we need to do to protect the environment both now and in the future through climate change. Then have supply and growing population, making water supplies more resilient to droughts and the impacts of climate change. So if you move to the next slide, this sets out, so you understand the challenge now that each of the regions had, what they were trying to do. But of course, this is the first time we've looked across trade and across regions. So we really needed to put a structure around this. So between all the regions, we looked at what are those trading opportunities? Where are those other new sources of water that we could turn to? And what are the new pipeline routes we might have to consider, or the existing infrastructure that we could better use? We then had to look at a process. So how are we going to make these judgments between what's a good trade and a bad trade between the various regions? So we set out a reconciliation process, and that had to be agreed up front before we started really getting into the kind of the planning problems themselves. So that was resolved. And then, having created all that, you heard me talk around best value plans. How do we look then at the best value metrics? It's not just creating trades based on cost, but also looking at environmental impacts, protection for customers, natural capital, biodiversity net gain, carbon, etc. Because water is a heavy product to move around the country. So you want to do it to create best value plans, but both for the region providing the resource, but also the region who's receiving that resource as well. We can move to the next slide, please. One of the key enablers for this, because we've all done water resource management plans and companies have been doing these for some time. One of the key enablers, I think, is going to be around the strategic resource options. So although in the southeast we had 750 new supply options, we had these varied from 1 megalitre per day to 300 megalitre per day. It was really those SROs, the strategic resource options, helped us unlock some of those kind of big regional transfers and enabled companies to kind of investigate potential sources of water that they wouldn't need within their own region, but could provide a benefit to other regions. And here I've just focused on the southeast because you can kind of see the type of transfers we were looking at. But it wasn't just about the transfers coming from one region to another. It was also then going to be about how do you transfer that benefit across your own region. So you had the interregional transfers, but intra-regional transfers as well. And that was all part of the consideration when we looked at these strategic resource options going forward. So, next slide, please. the challenges around trading. So fundamentally, we all kind of went into this with, what are the benefits? It must be a good thing, and inherently, you'd say transfers are a good thing. But I think the one thing to bear in mind with these trades is that these are not short-term trades. Typically, these are large pieces of infrastructure going in that will enable significant movement of water between regions, and typically there'll be long-term commitment. So when considering the trades, both the zones that were donating or companies that were providing the resources would have to consider their own long-term needs and also the risks, the uncertainties that they might face over that next 50-year period. And the same with the zones with the recipients of that water. So a lot of discussions, a lot of sensitivity work went around that, the what ifs, what if this happens. So we had some confidence in what those trades were and identified. The options of funding from Ofwat key to this, and I think for the next round, we'll talk about moving forward, but I think for the next round, further investment with these kind of big transfers would be kind of quite key to identify those options going forward. Now, having set up some of these, you then get into questions around system operation. So when you had several companies joining together to enable a trade to happen, they would have to go through their own assurance processes themselves and make sure their boards are comfortable, but then recognizing at some point a system operator might need to be developed in order to operate those trades between regions in a fair and objective way. Processes, agree on how the assets we're going to kind of transfer, get to those best value decisions, timing of the regional procedures. There was quite a lot of iterations going on between the regions. We had 3 rounds of reconciliation, and even after 3 rounds, there were still a few last minute tweaks that had to be forward, just as different policies and processes come through. So that talks about the speed at which regions can reassess their processes. And then at the end of the day, you've got to stand back from all this and just look at general risks and uncertainties. So my final slide in 10 seconds, Patrick, 10 minutes. So we set out kind of some ways which we can go forward. We think stronger governance around this so that it wasn't just the water companies and regions coming together with the regulators, but potentially kind of a broader top-down view of the UK and what would be the better trades, bearing in mind of industrial growth, etc. Consistent sets of national scenarios so that we're all kind of planning around these spatial events going forward, these challenging droughts with climate change, and a better consideration of the requirements for other sectors in terms of power and industry. And I think that was one of the big things that we couldn't fully capture this time round. So I think, sorry, 30 seconds over, but that's my 10 minutes.
I think you can definitely be forgiven for 50 seconds over, Merrick, given that we're running nicely ahead, which is brilliant, because I do think that, and that was a great introduction to the whole principles that are being run here, and then gives us more opportunity, I think, for discussion later on. Bob Hillier is going to be our next speaker, and Bob has over 30 years of experience in water resource planning, drought management, resilience and hydrology as a manager and senior advisor with the Environment Agency. For several years he was national lead for his main passion, which is agricultural water resources, and he now focuses on the really critical link between water and food security as the owner of the independent platform The Growing Voice, where he uses his experience and expertise to provide news and advice to the agricultural sector, a sector which I think has been hard hit by some extraordinary weather this year. So what I'd like to do is hand over to you, Bob.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Yes, so just on the first slide, I've talked to various people in water resources regulation, trading platforms and the farming sector itself before preparing this presentation, and indeed encourage them to attend so we can have an informed discussion. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So I started looking at regulations surrounding trades and water rights trading, but quickly moved on to wider factors such as politics and funding and influencing across regional trading trading, but also water, effluent sharing, water transfers, national grids. Thinking wider, as the supply-demand balance is so acute, not only for water companies, but also for water resilience, for food security, and overall business security in the agricultural sector. We've seen the effects of drought this year and in previous events and water companies with temporary use bans, drought permits and drought order applications, and farmers struggling with lack of water and declining reservoir stocks to irrigate crops and water and feed animals, with repercussions on yields and quality. My argument is that the need is now, and indeed has been there for some time. If we can move on to the next slide, thank you. So just a brief introduction to water rights trading regulation. Abstraction license trading is an agreement between two parties where a license holder, a seller, agrees to sell some or all of their water rights to someone else, a buyer. It can be temporary or permanent, and the arrangement can involve all or some of the license abstraction volumes, subject to not derogating, impacting the environment and other abstracted water users. Next slide, please. So the ambition for water rights trading and promotion of water rights trading sharing is in the Water Resource National Framework, with a need for agriculture to be optimising the distribution of water rights through water abstractor groups. The EA also kicked off a programme of local resource options, which there was around 20 of these across the country, looking at water resources solutions for small groups of farmers, with water rights trading effectively hardwired in as an option too. And a new round of these LROs is now being progressed. Next slide, please. So the need, there's a key need with reductions to supply. Water bodies are already under stress, they're not in good status, and water availability is low or effectively non-existent, especially at low flows in many parts of the country. And work by the EEA and its national framework is showing that more water will need to be clawed back from abstractors to meet the requirements of environmental destination, where water abstraction is environmentally sensitive, sustainable, both now and in the future, to water pressures, including climate change. Next slide, please. So the other part of the need is struggling to meet demand. Even without the current drought impacts, Essex and Suffolk Water, for example, has imposed a moratorium on new mains water connections for non-domestic use and told small businesses it would be unable to increase their usage above existing levels. Angling Water is also capping new connections across the region, and the Environment Agency has objected to planning applications and for housing developments in the Cambridge Water Resources Zone due to the risk of over-abstraction from the chalk aquifer. In addition, this year, we've seen a trial of water credits market in the Cambridge area, where developers will fund demand offsetting activity through purchase of credits, which will then deliver initiatives such as grey water reuse systems and rainwater harvesting systems. This is all very laudable, but even the water industry is saying we will see later that that won't be enough. Will developers stick to these Section 106 type agreements? I think most people would agree. They're certainly not followed perfectly across the country. And also in this slide is a paddling pool of 3,800 litres capacity, which is the equivalent of 27 people based on 140 litres per head per day, which is about the average water consumption. Are these non-household savings really going to pale into insignificance compared to household customer demand? Next slide, please. And delays to infrastructure delivery is really important. You only have to look at the huge delay in things like national infrastructure projects like HS2. In terms of water resources infrastructure, you have Angling Water Strategic Pipeline in East Anglia, which has been delayed for a variety of issues, including planning delays, land access, supply chain problems. These things are a reality. Hopefully lessons will be learned going into new reservoir developments, but nonetheless, delays are happening. This pipeline has designed itself to reduce demand on water-stressed water bodies, and farmers may well like to have access to some of this water and will certainly be appreciative of it freeing up to some extent water in indigenous receiving catchments. Can we have allocations of water for farmers in future water resource developments like the Lincolnshire and Fens reservoirs, where they can access water in the initial years when the water company doesn't need the full deployable output to meet its own customer demand? So will water trading give you more breathing space, more headroom against these delays and uncertainties? Can a water company obtain sufficient groundwater abstraction license from a farmer volume of water, use that at its existing treatment works if it has the capacity, and then provide more money, possible engineering expertise to allow the farmer to buy a surface water reservoir to store water? Next slide, please. So there are benefits also for agricultural drought management. Water trading is one of the options that farmers can ask for as part of the EA's flexible abstraction approach to drought and dry weather, the farming equivalent of a drought permit, where abstraction license conditions are effectively relaxed to allow farmers to increase their water availability subject to not impacting the environment. Back in the 2018 drought, there were around 150 of these flexible requests, with approximately 2/3 that were successful, and this includes the one shown here in Thetford, which involved groundwater trading. The farmer was very appreciative of the speed of this action to help him irrigate his crops. But since then, the number of requests has tended to drop off. A, because they're now limited to one request before you need to vary your abstraction license, with the associated costs that entails, the time they take to make a decision, and some of these trades may well be happening under the radar, using the existing inherent flexibility of abstraction license conditions to enable water sharing and using ring mains, for example, to pump water to irrigate crops. Next slide, please. There are also benefits for agriculture future water resilience. This is a reservoir in Suffolk, part of the East Suffolk Water Abstractor Group, which is being extended, and using water from the Felixstowe hydrocycle, using increased abstraction volumes to fill it. There's internal trading between the farm businesses, which is reaping the rewards of innovative solutions, working together and having storage. Really important, having storage. Another example is in Lincoln Water Transfers, helping members to effectively manage its water resources, allow efficient and effective use of abstraction licenses. It's one abstraction license between its members. It allows water, according to an agreed protocol, to be shared and managed. And these arrangements allow members to abstract water from drainage channels and irrigate any of the land defined in their license. It's a model of cooperation which will be highly relevant to other water abstractor groups as they evolve in response to increasing pressure on water resources and the need for greater flexibility. They have the opportunity to give water, pull the water before irrigation starts. This means everyone gets the water resources they need. The IDB's involved as well, running the scheme and collecting data. There's a telemetry system involved as well. And this information is then relayed back to the EA every week and is an important part of the scheme. This has to be the future of water trading. Also, the figures in that table, although they're old, and there's lack of transparency on that sort of data, there is a significant demand for water trading in the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. So let's return to what the water industry is saying about all of this. Water companies, through the Water UK, in response to the Independent Water Commission, said there was a need for reforming water bills by introduction of mandatory smart metering and allowing new tariffs towards very high users of water. There was an ask for devolving powers away from Whitehall, bringing the water companies together with land users like farmers to deliver most effective local improvements. And importantly, the need for a national water grid for England to move water around the country to where it's most needed to balance supply and demand. And that was an option that was previously turned down by the EEA in 2006. And importantly as well, they argued for better funding of regulators and the staff that work in them. And that's a really key issue as well. Next slide, please. So teasing out more of the challenges and opportunities from the workshops run by Wheatley Solutions. Again, the importance of a national water grid came up, learning from experience of lessons learned from previous trades, the use of wastewater, easier pre-application, and confirm the numbers for trading that are happening. Really important elements. Storage, again, is a major barrier to development. There's a need for shorter term trades, multi-use reservoirs, subsidies to those who don't abstract, freeing up water for those that need it across all sectors. Farmers undertaking water resources planning by transfers of skills from the water industry. There's a real need to get an acceptable template and roll it out across the country. A real opportunity for the likes of the Water for Food Group, working with the Environment Agency and water companies, and using water trading as part of the water company's drought permits, drought orders process. So on to the final slide and my conclusions. So to conclude, we need political will. We need funding to help water trading, investing in trading systems, workable policies, and having effective storage, use of technology to measure volumes in real time, like smart farming and smart metering. The government white paper needs to include water trading. There needs to be early engagement on future national regulatory policy on the role of the Water for Food, and that includes the role of the Water for Food group to help this. Trust farmers' view, the abstraction license is used or lose it, and that is not a very helpful position. Where is the connection between water and food security policy? It needs to be part of a genuine mix of supply side options as part of a twin track approach. There needs to be more certainty from trading, then they certainly give then potential savings from demand management and customer behavior, even admitted to by the water companies. There needs to be use of regional groundwater and surface systems models with appropriate operating time steps. And we need to think of the wider concept of water trading with water and wastewater sharing and the use of ring mains and multi-season reservoirs to ensure easier implementation and storage. And we need to have more water abstractor groups to allow more integrated water management. And we need to have things like the Lincolnshire Transfer and the Lower Nene Operational Group, which really help with multi-sector application, and particularly in events like the drought of this year. So that's a quick wrap up from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Bob. That was a really useful insight on a sector that I think this is sort of dominated, this group is dominated by people who work in the water industry, and it's very easy for us to become blind to the fact that it's not just the water industry that uses water. It's really, really valuable to have that kind of insight coming through, so thank you for that. The next person I'm going to hand over to is Simon Harrow. Simon is the Interim Director of Water Supply in Ofwat. He's working with the working in RAPID, but also with the environmental planning function. He's a technical and regulatory specialist and has 20 years experience in water and asset management. As many of you will be familiar, RAPID is the sort of key coordinating body of this, and I think Simon is going to be able to give us a lot more information and understanding of that. So over to you, Simon.
Everyone. So I'll just do a quick summary from a regulator's perspective. I work in Ofwat as the Interim Director for Water Supply, which covers investment planning and delivery from source to tap, which will include water resources and water trading, and also closely aligned with the RAPID team, which is a cross-regulatory function looking at large-scale water resource projects, which we call SRO, Strategic Resource Options, that Merrick mentioned, and no doubt Daniel will later. So in terms of the challenge, I think Merrick touched on this in terms of the scale of the problem. We've got 5,000 megalitres a day required by 2055, and that comes from the EA's National Framework Assessment. You know, it's an increasing challenge, so we need more water resources. Driving that challenge primarily is sustainable abstraction and the reductions coming through the EA's either WFD, WINEP programs, but longer term, the environmental destination, we're looking at future requirements that the environment needs. That's over half of that extra 5,000 that's needed to be found comes from that. But we also have population growth, which is driving some of the challenge, as well as economic growth. Non-household sector business demand growth has probably increased since that chart was developed, with the new government's focus in that area, as well as improving resilience standards. So this is where I think you saw in Merrick's slides, we're going from a worst historic drought, we then go to a 1 in 200 year level of resilience, and now we're moving towards a 1 in 500 year type resilience, and that requires more water resources to meet that standard. And the interventions is a twin track approach. We need to reduce demand. Companies need to reduce demand, it's reducing leakage, reducing customer demand, reducing business demand where possible, as well as improving the water supply infrastructure, increasing supplies. Could be new reservoirs, could be desalination, could be effluent recycling, but it's water trades are key there as well, where you can move water where it's more abundant, not necessarily abundant, but to the areas where it's more scarce, or where you can develop sources in areas more effectively and move it to those that it's harder to do so. Next slide, please. So in terms of the planning processes and the investment cycle, there's over 8 billion been identified to meet the supply-demand balance over the next 5 years. Investment comes out of water resource management plans. These are company level plans. They're statutory requirement to develop them. And if there's a supply demand deficit, a shortfall between supply and demand identified, investment or options are identified by companies. It could be demand management, it could be leakage, or it could be supply options, of which water trading would be one of them. As mentioned by American, and again, Daniel will probably touch on later, regional planning is a key component of this planning cycle, with that more regional top-down view of what's optimal across the nation, where can more water be moved around. It's not just in company level plans. We want an optimal best value plan across the whole country, ideally, and those regional groups are key in identifying that. So in terms of investment here, what we have is there's a significant metering program, which is 10 million smart meters being rolled out over the next 5 years. That will hopefully address deficits. It could increase surpluses for trading. There's demand management, there's leakage activities. We've got 2.4 billion being spent on the development of SROs. So these are those strategic resource options, which include large scale transfers. I've got a slide on that in a bit. But we also, and I don't think we can forget, there's supply options. There's kind of smaller supply options, 1.6 billion being spent on them. It could be water treatment works, upgrades to maximize output. It could be new boreholes, new river abstractions. Things that generally get delivered in the next 5 or 10 years. There's also supply interconnectors, and what those are, the smaller, some of them are quite big actually, but smaller level trades that might be within water company areas. They could be across water company areas. So within that water supply interconnector, there's a pipeline between Grapham and Cambridge. It's a significant transfer, but that falls in that area in terms of investment for that. So there's a lot of money, there's a lot of activity, and I think there's learning to be had from this price review, and I think that's the key focus. A lot of spend, a lot of activity, learnings, because we need to deliver a lot more than what's been identified in the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's some large scale projects being developed. A lot of these are being managed through Rapid. They have a gated process which help these schemes progress through. Of the schemes they're being looked at, 9 of those are water transfers or large scale water transfers. This includes the Severn Thames transfer. So that's effectively a river transfer from effectively Wales via the River Severn, via the River Thames, or pipelines to get it down to the southeast. There's the GUC, the Grand Union Canal transfer, which will take recycled water from Minworth in Birmingham, pass it down the Grand Union Canal. Obviously, infrastructure upgrades required to do that transfer, and then get it down to Affinity's area to free up water further down there. So there's lots of interesting transfers happening, and all this is part of a wider picture of what's needed going forward. Onto my next slide. So the last slide is kind of around the challenges and what's happening. We need more schemes, basically. More schemes are needed to prove that we've got an optimum investment plan going forward, both at the company level, at a regional level, and hopefully at a national level. Water trades are important as part of that picture, whether they're large scale major projects or SROs, or if they're smaller scale in that. And it's for companies to either fill deficits or even increase surpluses to look at trading. Ofwat tries to incentivize water trading, seen as a important activity, but also it has its problems. It's not easy necessarily to develop trades, to work with other companies, to work with third parties. So we have added incentives around that. There's water trading incentives. We're trying to encourage transparency in the availability of water and the need, so that third parties to get involved and offer trades to water companies, to increasing the visibility of that, as well as bid assessment frameworks, which encourage companies to set out how they'll assess a third party's trading option, and they'll treat it as fairly as their internal options. And Rapid itself, Rapid PR19, so 2019, RAPID was introduced. It's an alliance of regulators. There was also funding for the development of large-scale options. It was 17 options identified at PR19 over 5 years ago, with 469 million ring-fenced for their development, not the construction, just looking at the development and progressing them. That's been a success. There's now nearly 30, as you saw on the previous slide, but we also have the other regulators doing their bit. There's the National Appraisal Unit and the Environment Agency that's looking at the consistency of environmental appraisal, identify issues with these trades. Obviously, there's environmental factors, there's probably historic factors like things with like the GUC, canal transfer, as well as financial ones that Ofwat are more involved in. So that was a very quick recap of the things from my side, but that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Simon. I think that's a critical introduction to what's going on the sort of the national scale. And I always think that diagram and that map showing all of the options is the one that always gets your attention, because it really brings it together into one place and enables you to understand what's happening. As you mentioned, we're going to be joined now by Daniel Johns. So Daniel is the Managing Director of Water Resources East, which is an independent, not-for-profit membership organisation that's been tasked by government to create a national water resources plan for all sectors and for the environment in Eastern England. We've spoken already about agriculture. Clearly, this is an area of the country where there's a particular focus on that, and I'm sure that Daniel will be able to give us a little bit more insight on that. Daniel was previously a senior civil servant at DEFRA and has spent 4 years at the Climate Change Committee leading work on adaptation. So again, a real insight into sort of the events of this year and the increased probability of such events in the face of a climate change environment. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Hopefully my slides have appeared okay. So I'm going to pick up quite a few themes, I think, that we've already covered from Eric, from Bob, from Simon as well, about kind of water sharing, and also sharing not just across regions, but also between sectors as well. And Water Resources East, as you say, is an independent not-for-profit company. Our governance is slightly different to the other regional groups because agriculture is such a big part of the abstraction story in the east of England for all the reasons that Bob has set out. So we have the strategic authorities, or what will become strategic authorities, on our board, together with all 4 water companies that operate and supply customers in the region, with environmental interests for energy, for farming, and for housing development as well. I should also mention that not only is the East of England the most water scarce part of the UK, but it's also one of the fastest growing. And not only environmental challenges do we have to deal with, but also for the kind of growing economy too. Just also a quick plug, WRE is a membership organisation. It's free to join as a standard member. So if anybody on the call would like to join WRE, then please do get in touch, and there's a membership application form on our website. And we've got more than 200 members who take part in our strategic advisory groups, help shape our work, see some of our early findings, early, and help kind of shape our priorities going forward. So just to pick up again what Merrick has been talking in terms of that kind of regional water resources challenge, it's very similar. In the east of England as the most water scarce part of the country. And this isn't a challenge, I think, as the kind of description to today's webinar talked about, to be considered and solved by end of century. This is a here and now challenge, that actually the headroom that we have within supplies will disappear within the next year or two for the companies operating in the east. And when we published our first regional water resources plan back in December 2023, this was the kind of headline message, that economic prosperity and the health of the water environment are at risk, with an 800 million litres of water per day deficit by 2050 if we take no action. And it's also worth emphasising that that deficit was based on existing local plans that had been agreed at the time of publication. And it feels like the world has moved on significantly in the last 18 months in terms of new government targets for house building, Cambridge as a kind of as a hotbed for economic growth, the needs of the environment getting larger and coming forward, and new kind of water intensive industries popping up, particularly in the east around data centres, research labs, and so forth. So we published our plan back in December 2023. As Merrick said, it's an adaptive plan, so it can accommodate additional growth, it can accommodate additional environmental enhancement. But within our plan, you can see on the right-hand side in particular, a lot of it is about moving water around the region, sharing water between water companies, and I say also between sectors. What's not shown on the right-hand side is some of the kind of interregional transfers that allow water to be supplied to parts of the region like Cambridge. And I wanted to focus on Cambridge in particular as a kind of as an obvious and a perfect example why regional water resources planning is so important. So Cambridge Water as a single water resources zone, landlocked, doesn't have a coast to be able to build desal. It doesn't have a huge amount of land mass to kind of build reservoirs. And in the past, of course, it's had fantastic kind of groundwater resources in the chalk aquifers. But because of environmental improvements, because of the need to restore flow, Cambridge Water will progressively lose access to that groundwater resource and need to find its water from elsewhere. And it's going to become increasingly reliant, particularly on Anglian Water, but also on other water companies, and in fact, other regions to be able to meet their growing needs. And why is that? Well, because, as I say, Cambridge is a centre for really quite a water-intensive growth for the economy, but also for house building too. But it's also where you can see that kind of band of blue lines on the right-hand side. The band of chalk streams cross the Cam-Neely Ouse region and Cambridge Waters region in particular. So you've got massive growth, but also really quite significant changes in groundwater abstraction licenses and environmental improvements needed. So how does Cambridge Water obviously manage this situation? And that's a kind of that's reflected in the region more generally. So we know about the kind of the two major strategic reservoirs that are planned in the east of England. They were on Simon's chart earlier. The Fens Reservoir, which this artist's impression shows you, will supply both Cambridge Water and Anglian Water. So that water will be supplied, be split 50-50. Simon also mentioned the Cambridge Water transfer from Grafham Water. But the Grafham Water, well, Anglian Water can only supply Cambridge from Grafham Water because of the Grand Union Canal transfer, bringing water down from Minworth and from Birmingham. So unless affinity water is supplied from the Grand Union Canal, affinity water can't back off their demand from the Grafham Water reservoir. And if that doesn't happen, then the Grafham Water to Bury via Cambridge transfer can't take place. Bob also showed a schematic of how the Lincolnshire Reservoir up near Sleaford will be filled. And one of the most significant sources of water to fill the Lincolnshire Reservoir actually rises in the River Trent in Water Resources West region. So even the Lincolnshire Reservoir, which is going to supply Anglian Water 100%, is still filled and supplied from a kind of interregional transfer. And since the plan was published back in 2023, Essex and Suffolk Water are becoming increasingly interested in the Bacton desal plant on the Norfolk coast that Anglian Water are progressing with. And is there an option there for the Bacton desal plant also to supply Essex and Suffolk? And there's a lot of interest now in advanced water recycling at the larger water recycling centres, particularly on the coast. And these are all clearly in our region Anglian Water's assets, but as the advanced water recycling infrastructure goes in, it's likely to also supply Cambridge Water and Essex and Suffolk. So these are examples of how water companies are working much more closely together through WRE to find shared options and invest in shared infrastructure. But to move across to the agricultural space, and again, Bob has showed a version of this chart. On the face of it, there's absolutely massive opportunities for kind of sharing water and actually for formal trades between licenses. And perhaps we'll get in the Q&A, the reasons why those trades aren't necessarily happening right now. And I think some of the barriers are to do with, for example, the risk of deterioration. If a license is not being used for some time, can that existing license holder really sell that license to someone who will start to use it? And also the time it can take for license trades to go through. But certainly on the face of it, there is water available, even with these kind of water scarce areas. And as Bob mentions, the Environment Agency has funded now the first phase of around 20 local resource options for agricultural businesses, water abstractor groups to work together to share water potentially, to invest in shared infrastructure, and thought, as well as showing you where these local resource options are, the first phase on the left-hand side, clearly most of them were in the Water Resources East region, but on the right-hand side, showing you that one of the most important kind of recommendations or the most promising opportunities were in that kind of water sharing agreements and the water rights trading and license aggregation space as well. So Bob mentioned a couple of examples where farm businesses, like at the Lincoln Water Transfer, they've aggregated their license into one and then use that single abstraction license to fill a network of winter storage reservoirs where the farm businesses, they meet and they decide each year how much water each farm business needs. Clearly, it's not just about water rights trading. It's also about winter storage. It's about the hydrocycle approaches. It's about sharing final effluent, final treated effluent as well. But certainly, rights trading and sharing agreements is a big part of the potential answer. And a really exciting opportunity was one of those local resource options, LRO 20, on the south level, just south of the Ouse washes, where local farm businesses have come together to say, well, we've got a lot of winter storage as well, which we don't necessarily need. It's like an insurance policy for them. But they also have the land and the ability to build more winter storage reservoirs on their land. And if you then connect all those reservoirs up together, do you then create a quite significant strategic water resource that can supply Cambridge water? And winter storage reservoirs can be built much more quickly than reservoirs like the Fens and Lincolnshire. They're not of the same scale. And because each of them individually is fairly small, you can build them within a couple of years. And so we're now being asked to lead the next phase of the study to look at exactly how much water might there be within the south level, how much reservoir storage could be supplied sustainably from the abstraction that's available, how do you get that farm winter storage reservoir water into the public water supply, what treatment costs there might be, but how do you bring it in? But this is a quite exciting kind of multi-sector option which could be brought forward much more quickly than the Fens transfer, even the Graffham to Cambridge transfer, not as a replacement for them, but as a kind of medium-term option to help support the growth that we are seeing. And also another, I think, a significant kind of underutilized resource is that treated wastewater effluent. And Anglia Water, led by Jeff Darch, Jeff Darch led a study just a couple of months ago, which looked at all the individual kind of reuse opportunities to create non-potable water resources. And that could be, say, IDB drainage water. It could be rainwater harvesting, grey water recycling. And on the larger scale, it could be these strategic water resources, water recycling centres. And it could be even mine water. There's a lot of mines in the kind of West Country, up north as well, and the Mine Remediation Authority spends a lot of time pumping those mines to keep the groundwaters at a safe level. And then they ship that water across the region and they put it out to sea. With treatment, can you actually reuse some of that dewatered mine water and put it into non-potable water use? On the right-hand side is a map of around about 1,100, I think, 1,200 water recycling centres that Anglia Water operates. Not a lot of them are large, but certainly significant volumes of water potentially could be available, particularly where you've got housing growth, increasing the volumes of treated wastewater that then could be reused for irrigation, for golf courses, for agriculture as well. So just to finish off, last slide, and the other thing just to emphasize, this is, things are moving at pace now, not just in the East, but across the whole country. In the East, we've got, across the country, we've got the new National Framework for Water Resources that Simon mentioned. But in the East, we've got growing demand from big strategic projects like Universal Studios at Bedford. In fact, there was a story in yesterday's Sunday Times about whether or not there'll be not just the water, the kind of drinking water capacity to meet Universal Studios needs, but also is there sufficient water recycling centre capacity at Bedford? And those are the kind of challenges that the Cambridge Water Scarcity Group has been tackling with our help with the water companies, Feeding In and others. We're also expecting the recommendations from the New Towns Task Force any day, so potentially really quite significant new housing, new towns popping up, including potentially one or two in the east of England. East-West Rail is coming, and it will be quite water intensive, particularly the construction phase for making concrete, as will Sizewell C, that needs a potable source of supply in order to make concrete to the required security regulations. And we haven't mentioned yet Cunliffe. So the Cunliffe Review reported in July lots of 88 recommendations, not only about the kind of strategic stuff about a new water strategy, regional water authorities, creating a single independent integrated water regulator, but also pushing forward on the demand management side of things around compulsory smart metering and ending the kind of lunacy of falling block tariffs for larger non-household users. And I think the last point is that in the past, it didn't matter in the east of England whether per capita consumption, household consumption in the northwest was a problem. But as we increasingly interconnect all of our different regions, then it makes a big difference whether or not we can manage demand and keep a lid on spikes in demand in hot weather. As that water moves around the region. So let's not forget about demand management as an important part of kind of strategic water sharing into regions and into companies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's, again, another great bit of insight into how things are working and how these things do actually link up together. One of the things that you mentioned was about wastewater effluent, and I think obviously one of the things that's absolutely core with that is getting the treatment right before it goes anywhere near anybody's water supply. And so I'm glad on that basis to introduce Dr. Varsha Wiley, who is our final speaker. Varsha is a principal process engineer with Southern Water, has about 25 years of experience in the design and construction of water and wastewater treatment plants, and has worked extensively on UK projects for a number of different companies. So I think it can give some really valuable insight into how this is done and actually what the challenges are, both technical, but perhaps also what people's opinions are, which I think often tends to be one of the real issues when it comes down to this. So Varsha, I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping I'm not going to take the full 10 minutes because I just want to do a roundup of every speaker's opinions and points here. And I agree wholeheartedly with, for the most part, all of them. The bit we haven't talked about, and maybe this is where I come in, is the design and implementation of these large schemes. The challenges that the design side brings to the table when we talk about, let's say, Thames to Southern transfer, for example. We talk about where the source water comes from, the pipeline that needs to be designed and constructed, the specification that we need to understand. Water companies have got different specifications. Working to amalgamate those into one, bespoke specification to implement those schemes, that's time consuming. One of the elements about the design is the finished water quality. There is a big public perception issue about the, wholesomeness is great at the bottom end of a drinking water works. But when we talk about acceptance of this water, it's still a big issue. I chair the All Company Working Group on Water Recycling, and I can tell you that public opinion is critical to the success of these schemes. So I want to just bring some focus on the design side, the transfer side, and Bob talked about the planning delays aside. I'm not going to comment on all of that, but even the design and implementation can take a bit of time. When you look at environmental restrictions and sustainability reductions, the question I pose myself is, as we're talking about climate change and the implication on reduction of availability of water, well, that's going to be impacted everywhere else as well. So the source water, the donor sites, if you will, if they get impacted, this big infrastructure that we're putting in the ground is that at a risk of being, minimally used because there is no availability anymore from the source water side. Ownership of the water, funding of these, let's say if I put 50% of the funding, do I own 50% of the water rights? All of these questions fundamentally for me are really important. And I think where I'm getting at as well is water trading across region. I lived in the US for several years, and they do a lot of large conveyance system and transfer water from state to state. And it's practical, it can be done. But when you look at the technicality behind it, the water quality, the cost, the acceptance, all of these things can become quite difficult to surmount. I am a big advocate of trying to fix the supply-demand challenges in situ. All of the speakers here have touched on water recycling, have touched on desalination. These are high cost options, and I'm not moving away from that. They're very, very expensive, or they can be, but they're still quite key in when you look at the supply demand, the water resource management portfolio of options. They still, in my mind, have to be quite high up there. Having lived in East Anglia, I completely heard what Bob was saying as well, and what Daniel was just talking about. It is really difficult in those zones. I would like to say the south of England is also quite water scarce. Daniel, we're not going to play who's the most water scarce here, but it is definitely one of the challenges we see. And the way Southern Water is looking at it at this moment in time, with water recycling, looking at reduction of per capita consumption, metering, all these are valid options. But where I come in, the public perception element of any large scale treatment, desalination, water recycling has got to be brought. The public needs to be brought into that conversation. Water quality changes from different zones. We talk about bringing water from the north to the south. Well, softer water coming into harder water areas. What does that look like in terms of infrastructure? We talk about leveraging existing, I think Merrick said that at the early start, leveraging existing infrastructure. The infrastructure right now is not in the greatest of all shapes. So leveraging those requires another level of investment that we need to think about. And mainly the water quality impact that we'll have as well in moving water in a certain direction and changing directions because it suits. So I think from where I'm standing as a designer, looking at the construction, the implementation aspects, there's a lot of validity in water trading. But that being said, it needs to be done really carefully. Strategically, it makes sense. But when you come to when you go down into the weeds, it really makes sense to think about, do we have an adequate level of information from the Environment Agency, the planning authorities, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, all of these combinations of rapid as a whole, do we have enough information for us to expedite these big scale design systems, if you will? Do we have enough buy-in from the public that once we get this implemented, the water will be acceptable and will be accepted to be used by one and all? Do we have enough knowledge, research in the way our infrastructure currently sits, and therefore this new water is not going to have an unintended consequence at the receiving end? So all of these elements for me, from a design standpoint, become really important to facilitate water trading and any other development of sustainable treatment or augmenting water supply to meet supply demand deficit. So that's all I wanted to share. And I know we've only got about 28 minutes before the end of the session. So take it away from here, Patrick.
All right, thank you very much for that, Varsha. And I think that's, again, it's another really, really useful insight into the issues which are addressed in all of this. So, I mean, first of all, thanks everybody. That's it's been, I think a great start to what hopefully now I think will be one of the most important parts of this presentation in this session, which is a Q&A session. Now, I'd like to present this in the context of, please, let's have this as a discussion, because I don't think these are really any things that we can actually solve the problems. It's what's the most important thing here is to actually hear what the different opinions are within the group. So I think particularly if you feel slightly differently about how something could be handled in the future, then that's a point where this discussion can have particular value. Varsha, just to kick this off, I did have one follow-on to something that you said about that principle of local problems and being solved with local issues, because you simply don't know what's going to happen from from your donor region or whatever it is. And it is the one question that I've seen in the chat so far was very much about this, about how essentially how do you justify taking water from one area that may have a detriment on that area. But if you're trying to resolve a greater, a more urgent, a more significant problem in another area, that detriment could be social, it could be environmental. But how do we actually do that balancing act to say it is okay or it isn't okay?
I'm so pleased you preface this by saying we're not trying to find a solution, because I will tell you right now, I wrestle with that as well. We wrestle with this even when it comes to, and I believe Bob said that previously, if there is a groundwater license owner for, say, an industrial use, for example, can we do a bit of swapping here, and we'll treat the water to a recycled water quality and trade this water with you. Honestly, Patrick, this is one of the toughest questions in my mind, because the Environment Agency, rightly so, is looking strategically in terms of what are going to be all the compromised areas. And if we as a water company decide to embark on, I'll take your groundwater abstraction and give you this very expensive water, because water recycling is not cheap, is there certainty attached to the longevity of abstraction from that source? There isn't one. It is really difficult. This is even within the one region. Now, set aside, put that against the backdrop of inter-region transfer, it is very, very tough. Where we probably need to start thinking about is, somebody mentioned short-term, long-term use, is what in the short term can we do? Can we leverage existing, as I talked about, existing infrastructure, but that warrants knowing what that infrastructure looks like. So I'm kind of caveating this response by saying, provided we've got some competent infrastructure in place, can we leverage those sources for a very short term whilst preparing for a longer term solution, which to me still has to be within your locality, and using all of these effluent, when you look at hierarchy of water recycling, this is just to give some context. The very first ones are recycled or final effluent or treated effluent that goes out to the sea, because the sea doesn't really need this water at all, right? So trying to capture this, recycle it, and augment a reservoir, for example, or groundwater. These are the kind of technical things we need to be starting to think about. But whoever it is asked the question is absolutely spot on. It's a tricky one to answer. Short term we could, but it is reliant on very, very good infrastructure and some reassurance from the Environment Agency that, yeah, there is some longevity with that scheme. So it kind of validates your spend on that scheme, but it is a tricky one. But I would go back to saying, try and solve it within your own geography, if you will. Sorry, I don't know whose hand was up first, Patrick.
Yes, I'm going to go with Bob, because both B and H come before in the alphabet before D and J. So
yeah, fancy being V Wiley.
Yes. So Bob, over to you for a response on that one.
Yes, thanks, Patrick, and yeah, good response from Varsha. I guess you highlighted that we can't solve the problems today, and I think that's one of the fundamental problems, that we're so far behind the curve as a country dealing with these water resources issues. These issues should have been addressed years ago, and years ago, with water resource management planning. And they haven't been. There hasn't been enough investment in this. And we're seeing now in the likes of Cambridge that Daniel's highlighted, that these demand options, looking for people's behavior, are they really going to be enough to deal with those issues? They're required now. They're right at the tipping point in supply demand balance, going into deficits. So it's a real crucial issue that we're really behind on, and we need to catch up really, really soon.
I do agree. And I would just add one point before Daniel jumps in. We've been talking about water recycling, and I had to do a bit of research to find this out. I think since 2004, so WRMP 04, but there hasn't been a lot of steps put in place since that time, because obviously there was this notion that it's going to be okay. It's human nature, right? We tend to try and do that. But I do agree with you, Bob. Investment has been certainly lacking, and also information, access to information. You start with information, and we haven't collated those very well, in my mind. Sorry, Dan.
Well, yeah, just to kind of take it back to the question from Anonymous about, can we justify moving water from Lincolnshire down to meet the needs of Cambridge and its growth? I think that kind of misunderstands what we're trying to do here. The Lincolnshire Reservoir is just one part of the regional plan. It's a regional solution, as is the Fens Reservoir, as is Bacton and Mablethorpe desal plants, and as is the strategic pipeline that's being built right now, which connects up all the water resources zones, essentially from North Lincolnshire through down to Essex. And as Anonymous recognises, at some times the growth, the water demand might be in Lincolnshire, and other times it might be Essex, depending on what's going on. But these regional solutions plug in together to that strategic pipeline to allow Anglian Water and the other water companies to move water around the region to where it's needed at that time. So I think the idea that what we're doing is moving water from the north to the south is wrong. And let's not recognise, again, as Anonymous says, that there is also a lot of growth on the South Humber Bank for things like green hydrogen, carbon capture, use and storage. And that growth will be met by a combination of these regional solutions working in tandem in different ways at different times.
Eric, you had a hand raised.
Yeah, it was really around local versus the kind of movement of water. Patrick, I think a couple of things have happened in this planning round, and I've been planning for far too long now, I think, in some respects. Every planning round, the challenge we've got to meet increases. This one took a significant step turn this time when we could build in those future environmental needs, not just over a 5-year period, but over a much longer period of time. And that fundamentally means that a lot of the regions and companies were having to develop more and more options very, very quickly. And therefore, the local options run out quite quickly when you have to meet some of those higher targets that we're now looking at. And the need for water isn't just about environmental protection. It is about growth. It is about sustainable development. So I think for me, moving water is it's a heavy product, it takes a lot of energy, and we try and take account of that when we look at the kind of transfers. All the local schemes that Bob's been talking around, a lot of the companies have looked at some of those, and Bob, things like no debt really killed the kind of local license transfers that were going on or could have gone on down in parts of the regions much sooner before now. So I agree with Bob. We've got to try and unlock some of this quite quickly. There is the ability for companies to kind of invest in potentially other solutions that could facilitate trades. And there's some examples of that that's already gone on in the southeast between the power and the water industry. And even with some paper mills closing down and the water companies being able to use some of those resources. So I think I think it's just how do we stimulate those local trades much more than we're doing, because the bid assessment framework hasn't brought some of that stuff through. And we really do need to get to a point where we can generate those local options, and a combination of those with some of the kind of more strategic regional ones would be quite useful. The other bit I want to throw into this for people to consider is when I look back over the droughts, going right back in history, back to the 1921s and those times, the spatial pattern of droughts is quite varied and quite challenging. And we had the not bizarre situation, possibly a common one, where UU and other parts of the country were struggling, and for once the southeast wasn't in that kind of severe drought state. So the other bit around interconnections and trading is how do we join up the systems that actually allow movement of water more through that kind of national grid to help meet the challenges of different spatial droughts that we'll see in the future, because we know they're going to happen. And so I think that's another consideration we don't quite capture fully yet, and look at the benefits of some of these. But any trade has to ensure that it protects the environment, first and fundamental. And therefore, if it's not practical to kind of increase abstractions to help support a trade, then that trade shouldn't go ahead. I think try to pull a couple of bits together there, Patrick, looking at some of the comments in the question in the questions section as well.
Thank you. Now, Bob, I think you've got a hand up, unless that was a legacy hand.
I only need to say, because I'm sure there's other questions, just to respond back to Merrick about how we implement more of this water trade. And I think incentivizing people to to reduce their abstraction is key. Looking at water trading systems like weekly solutions, investing more in that, talking to the other sectors about how they operate, how their businesses work is really essential. And in storage, getting water management grants online, it really needs to be all joined up. And at the moment, it's not, and there's not enough money priming the pump, and that's the fundamental problem. Obviously, the government's got loads of issues to deal with, but if it's not going to deal with food security linked to water security, then we've got a fundamental problem.
And I'd just like to add one more thing to this is, aside of industry and where Bob's points are really sitting within the agricultural side and the farming side, we do need to understand that there is a regulation, the wholesomeness regulation, the regulation 4, the drinking water regs, that actually makes space for acceptance of water, and not, and therefore, wherever we think about a solution that moves water from different regions, domestic supplies and acceptance of that source water becomes incredibly important. People can reject your water if they don't want it or don't like it. That can kill a scheme outright. So strategically, it makes absolute sense. When the rubber meets the road, it may not. And we need to be very cognizant of that.
Thank you, Varsha. Simon, I was just thinking from a sort of regulatory and from an Ofwat perspective, if you had anything particular to add to this before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the trading, we rely very much on the WMP process and the regional plan process, and I think that's the aim, is that the regional plans identify an optimal best value. Again, it's not looking at the lowest cost; it has the widest benefits against those costs from a regional perspective. And I think as Merrick and Daniel mentioned, there's a regional plan reconciliation process that then makes sure that to some extent that the regions aren't being siloed themselves and it's optimal across regions. And that's the challenge that we check for, that there's enough options, because again, if there's not enough options being considered in a regional plan or a WMP, you'll run it through an optimizer and it won't choose the best option. So I think that's a risk, that if it's just selecting an option that might be moving water from one area to another area, but there's not been enough options being presented, it may not be optimal. The aim is to give it as many options as possible: demand options, leakage options, supply options, and a lot of that is using current assets. It is maximizing the actual assets that companies have, the abstraction availability that they have already before we look at new big things. And once we're comfortable that's been done, there's enough options so then when a program is presented that's gone through a company level WMP, a regional level plan, that there's enough scrutiny on that the options being presented are optimal, or at least with the information we currently have. Things change over time, and the rapid process adds another layer on that for the big schemes, so that the very large schemes have an extra level of engagement and scrutiny that go through them. There are staging posts where evidence is presented. So I think any solutions that come out, they'll have their difficulties. They're not optimal, and some of the extent we are trying to rush to catch up. I think one of the benefits of rapid, although you could argue that it could have been a bit earlier, is that we started to look a bit more regionally. We started to allow development funding for schemes that are difficult, and companies may not have wanted to spend their own money or customers' money on that could be delivering other things. So that happened in 2019. So arguably that could have been done 5 or 10 years earlier and we'd be in a better position. Some of these reservoirs and transfers and desal plants will be going live, but we are effectively 5 years ahead of where we would have been without that. And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment, that there's difficulties with these and there's some difficult decisions, but I think through the process and the planning process, we are comfortable with kind of what's being presented. It's back to, to some extent about delivery now. I think I had 104 billion on one of my slides. That's the overall investment the water sector has. It's a significant step up. Obviously, we want that delivery done well, carefully, and focus in the right areas. But I think there is a push now for delivery, because actually not delivering some of these schemes potentially more harmful for the environment than maybe in hindsight than being a little bit suboptimal.
Right, thank you for that, Simon. I think that does lead us quite neatly on to our next question, which is from James Dodd, which is, I'll just read this out. So, as Cunliffe has intimated, so this is the Cunliffe report, would the regional planning process benefit from a national government body with a focus on water resources planning and management rather than it being led as a water company-led approach? Would that help with regulatory consistency, as Varsha mentioned, design and specification consistency? Because if you've got different specifications between different companies, that's surely an issue which would get resolved with a central body overseeing this. I've already got Daniel saying, yeah, be interested in actually giving a first response to that one. But I think this is really quite an interesting one as a prompt for this group. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, well, I would argue we already have a national body with oversight of water resources planning in the Environment Agency, and they published a second national framework for water resources just back in June. And what that does is it sets the standards, sets the framework for multi-sector water resources planning. Yes, for the water companies, but also for agriculture, for energy, and the other major abstracting industries. We also have Rapid also, which again, Simon describes, has a oversight of all the strategic water resources infrastructure, and Cunliffe is intimating that actually Rapid should be extended into water recycling and other aspects of water infrastructure too. What we can't have is water companies being given a plan to deliver by somebody else. We can't have the new integrated regulator. We can't have the new regional water authorities coming up with a plan which isn't deliverable and it isn't financeable. And it's only the water company boards that can judge and assess that. So what we need to have is a kind of bottom-up process where options are developed and water company boards with regional groups helping them to come up with what the plans should be. And then the regional water authority, as set up potentially under those Cunliffe recommendations, might then approve the plan or a version of the plan which meets regional and national objectives. So there will continue to be a negotiation, a kind of dialogue, iteration between the kind of water company and regional groups and the regulators, the regional water authorities. But what you can't have is a regional water authority dictating what water companies should do.
I think, Merrick, you had a hand up next.
Yeah. So I don't disagree with Daniel. I think the one bit where a national perspective helps, though, is when we consider the kind of industrial growth strategies for the country, when you consider, with the carbon challenge and the green energy and elements like this, Patrick, that you really need to kind of get that overview sometimes, that kind of more top-down strategic view of the world, and where some of these developments might happen that might not be in existing plans that are in the public domain, because that would then help us and in a more rigorous and robust way so that we can align transfers and movement of water with where that potential needs will be, or possibly leave it in areas because there might be something that could be over the horizon and developing quickly. So I think adding that kind of additional view of the world in terms of the UK and the great industrial growth strategies would help a lot. And I think for me, the other element of this is that as abstraction reform comes in, and you've got industries who have their own sources of supply at this moment in time, they might not be as reliable as they have been in the past with the change in license conditions. And to Bob's point, having that debate about resilience of these other sectors from a water perspective would be quite interesting, because the industry is going to plan for 1 in 500, but I don't think any of the other industries would be at the same level of resilience. So kind of a couple more points there.
Thank you. And Bob, you have a hand raised as well.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think sort of building on what Merrick's saying, I think a national overview is really essential to bring everything together, strands and government policy. I think, water resources regional plan is an improved plan, but at the same time, it does highlight that it's got weaknesses with regard to other needs like agriculture, and the government's agriculture policy needs to be hardwired into that And again, going back to money, if it needs money, if it needs more resource, if it needs more water systems modeling, we used to have national water resources strategies, and they seem to be airbrushed out of history. And they had some fantastic water resources systems modeling numbers behind them. And we need to get back to the fundamental building blocks of water resources planning, not just the aspiration that's in the national framework. We need to actually build on numbers, numerical modeling to take water resources planning further on a multi-sector basis.
Thank you. And do we have any other replies from the panel on this particular point? The reason I'm asking this is we sort of don't have quite enough time to go into a different. Thank you, Simon. Perfect.
Thanks. I think probably echoing what people have said. We see the importance of regional planning. I think I've said that in my talk. It seems like the right level for large-scale water resources. There's debates about what works for wastewater and in general environment planning, because obviously there's meant to be a look at holistic planning coming out of Cunliffe and, potentially, as you say, moving more to a multi-sector thinking as well. But for large infrastructure, you don't want that siloed approach, whether it's at a company level or even a regional level. So that layer that would build on what we already have, and I think is generally working. It's the first time around we've had all regional groups. We've only had them for 5 years. So I think that's working. And the national view, we're very keen that there is that national view, just in case there's any trade-offs required. Is there enough supply in terms of workforce or supply chain issues? Who gets the water? Again, current bodies can make those decisions, but is there a kind of consistency of approach taken? But also around setting objectives for the sector. These assets, more than any others that the water companies have generally, take a long time to plan and deliver. So therefore, if you're setting resilience levels, if you're setting targets for leakage, per capita consumption, if you're setting levels of abstraction reduction, they need to be long-term, they need to be stable, companies to plan to them and deliver to them. And we see that's the important role of a national or government-led organisation that sets those. They stay relatively stable, companies and the regions can plan to them and deliver on them without changing anything in between.
I think from where I come in there, Patrick, if I may jump in, is this whole notion of we are stepping outside of the AMP cycle, the asset management period, to the 5-year cycle of investment, and going into one layer above that, which is looking at long-term solution that, as Simon was just saying there, long-term planning and long-term strategic view. How these projects do take time. And to go back to the actual question you posed, you kind of started off by talking about, is there a need for looking at strategically or nationally, how do we get implementation in place such that we can expedite these processes, these systems, and put the infrastructure in place? That's a tricky question in the sense that I don't know if there is a regulatory body that will want to take on board the design elements, of putting big infrastructure in place. It's already a big monster to deal with regulation. Now pair that up with, you need to have this X, Y, and Z specification in designing pipelines and wide infrastructure. It's probably a step too far. Mind you, there are some guidance out there for design already. It's just meshing those together when we talk about different water companies and different bodies working together. But it is a wholesale change we're looking for here. I think we need to start bringing in the industrial, East Anglia is blessed or cursed with those guys. It's whether when they are looking to have a new license, they already got plans to apply water recycling within their organization. We have data centers that are coming in, but there is no plans to have data centers coming in with a recycled water scheme attached to it, right? So it's almost looking at where are these big water users, to go back to where Bob's pain point is, are we able to leverage some of these big users and look at what they do internally within their own houses to recycle water? I think there's a great bit of, there is a conversation to be had out there. And industrial reuse does not require certain materials in contact with drinking water to be regulated. So they can actually help a lot in that sense. Where we are in the south, there aren't that many industrial users, I guess. So domestic is the biggest problem for us.
Okay, well, we're running pretty hard into our
Yeah.
time limit now. So I wanted to say thank you very much to all our speakers. You've been great. It's and I think probably one of the themes that comes out from this particular seminar is that this is wide-ranging, and that's reflected by, thankfully now quite a wide-ranging group of people with wide-ranging issues and wide-ranging interests and abilities. And it is something that, as using the term water sector in the context of those people who use water, I think the water sector is becoming much more aware that this is the case, that it's absolutely not just the water companies, it's the whole process from start to finish. It does still feel like we are running fast to catch up. I take your point, Bob, that almost a feeling of, oh, we should have done this a long time ago. I think everybody always feels that on every large program of work. I think the encouraging thing is that that program of work is actually underway in a way that I have not seen at any point in my career, and that actually is quite exciting. So I think with that in mind, and a final thank you, I will hand back to Ethne for a very quick final wrap up.
Thank you so much. Just to echo Patrick, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of our speakers for their brilliant contributions, and of course to Patrick as well for his expert chairing, and for all of you for attending and taking part in this lively discussion. I'm going to make it quick. I know we're running out of time. This event has been recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel and website. If you're a member of the IES, don't forget to record your attendance on the members area of our website as part of our CPD tool. And if you're not a member, please do consider joining. The next FWR event is taking place on the 9th of October, and this will be on unlocking multiple benefits from nature-based solutions. And this will be open for registration soon. Those signed up to our mailing list will hear about that first. Thank you once again to everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.